Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Cooper Union. Welcome to the Great Hall. I'm Laura Sparks, the president of the Cooper Union, and it is my distinct honor to introduce this timely conversation and our keynote speaker tonight. But before I do that, I first want to thank our co-sponsors for this event. The FPWA is an anti-poverty policy and advocacy nonprofit with a membership network of nearly 170 human services and faith-based organizations. FPWA has been a really prominent force in New York City's social service system for nearly a century. I want to thank especially Jennifer Jones-Austin, the organization's CEO and executive director, for really making this event possible and bringing this discussion to the Cooper Union. Jennifer and I had an opportunity to meet at a dinner that was hosted by another college president, and we were kind of sitting across from each other and making eye contact at key moments in the conversation, and I knew I had a thought partner in Jennifer. I'm so grateful that we had a chance to work on this together and so appreciative for your efforts. I also want to thank Emily Miles on her team. Emily's been extraordinary in helping to pull this together, and Danielle Daughtry and Kim Newman on our team for working with her. You are probably aware that 50 years ago tomorrow, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had his last full day on this earth. He spent his last night at a local church in Memphis where he gave his "I have been to a mountaintop" speech. And in that, he reiterated his quintessential message, which was that peaceful demonstrations were the best course of action and the only way to guarantee that the demands of protesters would be heard and answered. So think about if Dr. King were still with us today. He would be nearly 90 years old. Something tells me he would be still as active as his age would allow him. And while I think there are a number of things that he would probably have significant frustration about, I think he would be pleased with the recent period of increased civic engagement and sustained social action that our country has been experiencing. From Black Lives Matter to Me Too to the Resistors and Dreamers, millions of Americans are taking to the streets and calling for massive social change and accountability at levels not seen since King was alive. Despite this momentum and the volume of participants, I think we all have to wonder, will this simply be a moment in our nation's history, or is it the beginning of something bigger? How, as a community, can we ensure that this moment of increased awareness and action will evolve into a long-term, sustained social movement? Here at the Cooper Union and in this great hall, we have welcomed peaceful protests, civic discourse, and social action for more than 150 years. From leading suffragists to abolitionists and civil rights and equal rights activists, this hall has really been a platform for some of the most important movements of the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, and it's one of the reasons why we're so proud to be part of this conversation tonight in this room. Tonight we add several additional voices to this legacy. First, the Reverend Dr. James Alexander Forbes, Jr., who is the Distinguished Senior Minister Emeritus of the Riverside Church, will open our event with his keynote address. Dr. Forbes was called to the ministry in 1956, which took him to New York City from North Carolina. He completed a Master of Divinity degree from Union Theological Seminary. In 1989, he was installed as the 5th senior minister of the Riverside Church and was the first African American in that role. Riverside Church was built by John D. Rockefeller Jr. in 1927 as an interdenominational, interracial, and international church, and today the congregation includes more than 40 different ethnic groups. Dr. Forbes has taught at Union Theological Seminary and the Auburn Theological Seminary and authored the book, Whose Gospel? A Concise Guide to Progressive Protestantism. Please join me in welcoming the legendary Dr. Forbes.
I want to speak to you from the theme, The Second Coming of King and the New American Dream. The opportunity to reflect on the life and legacy of Dr. King is particularly meaningful to me because Dr. King was born January 15, 1929, and I was born on September 6, 1935, nearly 7 years later. But I had never heard of Dr. King until after December 1st, 1955, when Mrs. Rosa Parks refused to get up on a crowded bus in order to relinquish her seat to a white man. On December 5th, 50,000 black people in Montgomery, Alabama refused to ride the bus until they could do so as full citizens, not circumscribed by a racist system. A few days into the movement, the young pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, was called to be the leader of what turned out to be the modern civil rights movement. His work leading the bus boycott to achieve justice in public transportation, then interstate transportation, public accommodations, and voting rights for people of color, catapulted him into national and international fame. His actions and his speeches were reported on radio and television. It is for this reason that it was so exciting for me that on February 10th, 1957, my mother took me to the meeting at Needham Broughton High School in Raleigh, North Carolina, on the white side of town, where I got the first opportunity to see Dr. King in person and to hear his most inspiring, uplifting, challenging, and encouraging words. There was something mesmerizing and enchanting about his voice. My mother noticed that I was captivated by his spirit. Later, when I was getting ready to come to Union Theological Seminary in New York, my mother, as I was packing my bag, inserted 2 books into my suitcase. One was the King James Version of the Bible, and the other, well, let me tell you why that. It was because she knew that Union was a liberal theological seminary and would be probably using the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, which some evangelicals and Pentecostals used to call the Reverse Vision Bible. And the other book was Dr. King's first book, Stride Toward Freedom, the book that became a primer for my theological understanding. During my college years at Howard University, Dr. King came to the campus to speak. I was the head waiter at the Baldwin Hall Dining Hall and had the inestimable privilege of serving dinner to Dr. King. My next encounter with Dr. King took place at Shaw University in the early 60s, where he had come to help form the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, better known as SNCC. I was introduced to him then by my brother, the Reverend David Forbes, who at the time was president of the Shaw University student body. Following Dr. King's visit, David led the students in a sit-in at the local Woolworth 5 and dime store. When the barriers came down, I was so happy, delighted to at last, for the first time, not just to have to smell the sandwiches, but to sit down for the first time in my life at the lunch counter of the 5 and dime Worldworth store. Well, I knew exactly what I was going to buy. A hot dog with mustard, relish, and ketchup. And I was going to get a big orange drink. Upon sitting down, even before I could order, and I do not recall, Dr. Bravium, even by hypnosis, I cannot recall whether I ever put in my order, because a white woman I had sat next to immediately sprang to her feet and ran out of the store. I was humiliated, so hurt, so devastated that I went home and wrote this poem. Why did she move when I sat down? Surely she could not judge so soon that my Saturday bath had worn away, or that savage passion had threatened rape. Perhaps it was the cash she had tucked in her purse, a full month's supply that worried her so, or that tomorrow her lips might touch the cup my darkened hands had clutched. In terror, I too should have fled away, for prejudice smells like a dying beast. Rapists and races have savage roots, and the greatest theft is one's dignity. What an experience. In those days, I also participated in sit-ins myself. I sat in at a lunch counter at Sappho's Restaurant in Wilmington, North Carolina. Years later, Mr. Sappho became the mayor of Wilmington, North Carolina. I heard about Dr. King's dream in 1963 at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. I heard about the killing of Addie Mae Collins, Carol Denise McNair, Carol Robinson, and Cynthia Wesley at the bombing of the 16th Street Church in Birmingham. I followed the ups and downs of King's imprisonments, the bombing of his home, incessant threatening telephone calls, his being beaten by police or pelted with bricks by thugs in Cicero, Illinois. I became convinced that here, in this man, was a prophet sent from God on a quest for the beloved community. I was convinced that Dr. King was the one to help our nation become a great nation, the great nation we thought we were but had not yet become. He was our hope for a bright future. Then on April 4th, 1968, 50 years from tomorrow, and as soon as I leave here, get a little rest, I'm going to be traveling to Memphis, and I'll have a chance to talk on the balcony of Lorraine Motel. I heard the news of his murder as I was headed to my work at Medical College of Virginia in Richmond, where I was in chaplaincy training. I was traveling on the Marshall Street Bridge as I heard the news, shot, probably fatally. Tears flooded my eyes, and I scarcely made it across the bridge. But when I did, I turned into the parking lot at Medical College of Virginia, sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, and said aloud, "Martin, you shall not have died in vain." You get that? Martin, you shall not have died in vain. That's what I said. During that same time of my chaplaincy at the Medical College of Virginia, our chaplaincy program required us to produce a written account of the verbal exchanges with each patient we visited to see competencies for being chaplains. And here is one of those visits. I went into the room of a white woman, introduced myself, and offered to be helpful in any way that I could. I asked if she wanted prayer, scripture, or if there was anything she wanted to talk about. And this is what she said: "The best way you can comfort me is to get the hell out of my room. I don't believe any of that religious she said the actual word, you are talking about, and I don't believe in God. So if you don't get the hell out of here, I'm going to call security to kick your A out of here." As I passed out my verbatim of what had happened and the group read it, the supervisor asked me, "Jim, how did that make you feel?" I said, "I was devastated by the response." He asked me, "Did it make you feel like shit?" I said, "Sir," I said, "now, my parents taught me that there are adequate words in the English language to express one's thought without resorting to foul language." The supervisor persisted and asked me again, "Well, I know that, but did it make you feel like shit?" I said, "You may ask me that as much as you wish. I have my own way of expressing how I feel." Then he explained to me, "Jim, I am not so much concerned about the words you use. What concerns me is that if the most humiliating moments of your life keep you locked into prescribed language that may not fully convey the depth of your hurt, you restrict your own freedom to be who you are, to feel what you feel, and to say what comes most naturally to your mind. Whether it was your parents or your religion or the culture that binds you to prescribed patterns of expression, you are not yet a free person. I hate to say this to you, but you will never be a great leader until you can learn to say shit. My public discourse is still characterized by discipline in expression, but I now appreciate the point he was trying to make. You may wonder, what has that story got to do with Dr. King? And since I'm almost halfway through, I'm glad you asked that question. This year, on January 15th, the spirit of Dr. King woke me up in my dreams, and he explained to me that yesterday, January 14th, there were many celebrations of my birthday, a day ahead of the official Monday of my birthday celebration. But the celebrations were interrupted by reports of discussion that had taken place in the Oval Office by the President during discussions of immigration policy. He had used transgressive language in the Oval Office, implying that people from Haiti and Africa were like so much waste or excrement. And Dr. King said to me, and now it seemed I was a little bit not quite asleep, but his spirit said, people seem more upset by the curse word he had used than by the attitude or the pernicious policies that are being implemented steadily and surreptitiously day by day. Dr. King urged me to address this issue so that instead of being distracted by discursive language, by cuss words, people might focus on what really matters most. By the way, this is also King's concern as we prepare to commemorate the anniversary of his assassination in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th, 1968. We can dwell on the gory details of the dastardly deed that was done that day, or we can hear more clearly, and that's just what he would wish, the message that he lived for and died trying to address our nation and the world. Let us not be distracted by the horror stories of the event, but let us hear clearly what God was saying to us, our nation, and the world through this black prophet from Atlanta, Georgia. According to my watch, I only have about 8 more minutes. So let me quickly tell you a conversation that I imagined taking place between Martin and God. Martin, on the 50th anniversary of your martyrdom, in order to show that you did not shed your blood in vain, heaven is arranging dramatic divine manifestations on earth. I, says God, am launching the decade of Jubilee justice of the dream. I am launching on the occasion of the 50th anniversary, commemoration, remembrance of your assassination. I am responding, says God, imagination, by launching the decade of Jubilee justice toward the realization of the dream you talked about, struggled for, suffered abuse, rejection, denial, vilification. I'm starting in your honor the decade Jubilee justice, you're going to find that there's going to be on earth dramatic, divine demonstration of power. Now, Martin, those who are willing to be a part of the dream team, that's what I'm calling it, those who work for Jubilee justice toward the realization of the dream. Those who are willing to be a part of the dream team will experience what you used to call cosmic companionship. That is, for those who are invested, and if it takes 10 years to make sure that the dream you talked about becomes a living reality, whoever gets to be a part of that dream team, to work constantly under the guidance of the great spirit of justice and love and peace and compassion, whoever joins the dream team will experience my presence in an unusual way, strengthening and encouraging and lifting them. They will receive sublime satisfaction that they are engaged in a cause worthy of the highest commendation. Whoever accepts being on the dream team for Jubilee Justice will experience the ecstasy of some significant achievement in their efforts to serve the cause, and also, and this matters a lot to all human beings, black or white, rich or poor, Catholic, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, just Homo sapiens of any variety of either migration, they will discover the assurance that, like you, Martin, their efforts in the struggle for justice will not be in vain in fulfilling their destiny and my ultimate dream of creation. So, Martin, I'm going to grant you the opportunity to be the new Black Panther. You're going to rise again in spirit. You're going to get a chance to go back to earth in spirit for the purpose of clarifying and broadening the understanding of the dream. Because, Martin, I've seen you wince up in heaven. Every year they talk about, I have a dream that one day black boys and girls and white boys and girls will hold hands together and they'll sit down at the table. Martin, every time you hear that speech, you said, oh my God, these people are trivializing all I lived for. Those black boys and girls holding hands. Martin, I'm going to give you a chance, a second chance, to go back to clarify and broaden the understanding of the dream, and also to enlist everybody you can to become members of the dream team. Well, I'm not really watching my watch, but it feels like I only have 5 minutes left. So, let me tell you why I'm not too nervous that I don't have much more time to talk. Because it is going to take you at least a year of reading everything Dr. King ever wrote, parsing the lines and the sentences and the words. Anybody who's wanting to be on the dream team commits to making sure that you are not relying on fake news about what he meant. You are going to insist You for yourself. This man's too important. Life meant too much. Too towering a figure in global consciousness to go on journalistic assessments of what the dream was. Martin, you're going to have a chance to show them through everything you've said. And they are wonderful volumes. Cooper Union will make them available. Your library has them. My friend Jim Washington, my dearest friend, wrote the complete works of King, A Testament of Hope, and every year I read some more of it. And just last night I read 5 of them. It's fascinating how you got to, please, folks, don't just read the I Have a Dream speech. Or at least don't just read the part that talks about I have a dream. Read cashing that check that never got cashed. Read why they had come to protest about the forfeiture of the freedoms that were to be guaranteed to all Americans. Read the whole, at least if you're going to do the I have it, read the whole speech, please. Not just at the end, the prodigious mountaintops of this and the valleys of, don't just read the juicy part. Read the heart of what this was about. What was the dream about? And before that, if you really want to know, read, if you get the Testament of Hope. Before that speech, there is the speech about the American dream delivered at Lincoln University the year before that one. And after that, read the rest of the speeches that have to do with what he said after the martyrdom of the girls at the Birmingham 16th Street Baptist Church. And read what he said at the acceptance in Norway, those wonderful people from Norway, Oslo, that Trump talked about. Read what he said there about why he was accepting the Nobel Peace Prize. Read his book, Where Do We Go From Him? Here, read Strength to Love. Take a year. You can't use one April 3rd night at Cooper Union or either tomorrow listening at what they say. It's going to take you a year to understand the depth of the dream. And also, I think it's important to say that if you really want me to end, maybe I should end with just one comment. And it is this. So Dr. King is coming back. I'm expecting to feel his spirit tomorrow when I get to Memphis. And I just know that one of the things he's going to say is, my friends, thank you so very much for your response to my martyrdom 50 years ago. Many of you, not heeding my call for nonviolence, erupted in the streets with destructive behavior. And those of you who were more sane about it put up my name on streets all across this country, Martin Luther King Boulevards. Thank you for at least mentioning my name. But now that I have come back for my second coming, I want to ask you to do a little bit better than that. Instead of naming streets for me, from where I have been in heaven for the last 50 years, I've looked down on the world, and something more serious is needed. For from where I was perched in high places above the earth, and looked down and had a panoramic view of the dynamic of social, economic, and political reality in the world, I've observed a major malaise. That malaise, for a lack of a better term, is you as a society, as a civilization, have reached the point of fatal despiritualization. By despiritualization, I mean, says Dr. King, the condition when a society has lost connection to the sources of meaning and purpose, responsibility, accountability, environmental hospitality, and fundamental dimensions of relationality between nature, self, and God. He says, this is a deadly disease. This is why your nation is suffering for the first time in 3 years, steady decline in life expectancy. This despiritualization, this disconnection from the foundation of meaning and value, the what for of our lives, we come going, spending ourselves in countless ways, seeking to develop, as Becker says, our own illusions of immortality. But you can't get that from sex. You can't get that from money. You can't get that from hate. You can't get that from dehumanizing people. You, in your loss of connection to what binds people together, to what gives meaning to Homo sapiens, to people, without that subterranean basis of meaning, which some folks call soul, and some folks call spirit, and some folk just plain call purpose, and some people just call dharma. Without a spiritual foundation, a society might as well go on and dig the grave, or nuclear annihilation or germ warfare will bring you to your end. And Dr. King says, so do me a favor. In my second coming, I want to get a chance to give clarity about what the American dream was supposed to be, and then to tell you how to get started towards making it possible. And then he'll tell you this. Really, I know it's time to quit. He'll say this. You know, there's some other things that died when I died. You killed me because I was there to deal with having killed the sanitation workers. And then there are countless other people who in poverty died for lack of basic health care provisions. And you killed something else. After the riots, white folks got so scared of black folks that they really escalated the process of urban renewal. And urban renewal meant we are scared of the Negroes. The best way to give ourselves safety in our cities is to move the virus, the stuff. I almost said it. The waste. Get it moved. And guess what? You even the next year finally killed Beale Street. You actually killed it. You killed it. Handy had talked about it, half a century before. You see pretty browns in beautiful gowns. You see tailor-mades and hand-me-downs. You meet honest men and pickpocket skilled. You'll find that business that never closed till somebody gets killed. If Beale Street could talk, married men would have to take their beds and walk, except one or two who never drink booze, and the blind man on the corner who sings the Beale Street blues. He said, I'd rather be there than anywhere I know. Yes, I'd rather be here than any place I know. It's going to take the surgeon to make me go. I'm going to the river, maybe by and by. Yes, I'm going to the river. And there's a reason why. Because the river's wet and Beale Street done gone dry. And Dr. King will ask, and tomorrow I will ask Memphis, if you really want to see the beginning of the restoration of the true meaning of the American dream, bring during this Jubilee Justice, a restoration of Beale Street, the institutions that are there, build them, renew them. And the people that you dispatched, they actually are some of the S-hole folks that Trump talked about. Find them, bring them back. See if you can find Evis. See if you can find Handy. See if you can get BB to come on back. See if you can get these black folks, because guess what? For a despiritualized culture, they are actually God's trump in the hole, whereby African sensibility of respect for ancestors, of respect for spirit, a sense of nothing different between sacred and secular except your style. People who say, I am because we are. It could turn out that the thing that black folks are arming themselves to the gills about, getting guns to keep black folks from having revenge for slavery. Man, black folks are too ready to get back to Beale Street. We ain't got time to fight white folks. Put your guns away, folks. Your kids gonna get hurt with them anyway. And come on and get ready, because when Beale Street gets restored and the people come back, you will discover that this black interstitial tissue will help white folks and other folks figure out to be just plain folks. And man, when we get back to that, that is going to be the beginning. In fact, Memphis, which had already started to become the city of martyrs, could, in my second coming, become a city of miracles. And let me tell you, I'm going to Memphis tomorrow, but I want to wait to see what we as Americans will do for the restoration of Beale Street and 125th Street and all the Martin Luther King Boulevards. What a city that is going to be. I don't think you got time to come up here, but if you were here, Branda, are you here? Is Branda here? If not, I'll do it myself. I tell you, I want to see the new American dream. And I am committing myself to being on the dream team. And I'm ready to give my life right along with Martin until I can see that beautiful city. Oh, what a beautiful city. Oh, what a beautiful city. Oh, what a beautiful city. 12 gates in the city. Hallelujah.
Thank you, Dr. Forbes. Thank you for reminding us of the work that is required for this, of the endurance and of the depth, and of the fact that we don't need to rely on sound bites and various forms of media, that we can go right to the source. It is now my pleasure to introduce three panelists who will join Dr. Forbes for a discussion about the parallels between the civil rights debates of the past and our current moment. The challenges that popular campaigns face and the role that the media does play and that the community plays in these interests. I'm going to ask the panelists to come up and join us on stage. We have Jennifer Jones-Austin, Donna Lieberman, and Khalil Muhammad. And as they come up, I will introduce them. Jennifer Jones-Austin, as I mentioned before, is the talented leader of FPWA and our co-sponsor for the event. And at FPWA, she fights daily for the equality for all New Yorkers. In fact, Jennifer has made a career of protecting children and other vulnerable populations. Previously at the United Way of New York City and the city's Administration for Children's Services. She is the daughter of civil rights leader, the Reverend William A. Jones, so faith-based activism is in her blood. Welcome, Jennifer, and again, thank you so much for pulling this extraordinary panel together. To her left is Donna Lieberman. Donna probably needs no introduction. She's the executive director of the New York Civil Liberties Union, a position that she has held since 2001. She's one of the nation's foremost defenders of civil liberties and civil rights, championing public school safety, fighting for family rights, protecting the right to protest, and challenging racial profiling and other misconduct by law enforcement. Donna began her public interest legal career as a criminal defense lawyer in the South Bronx office of the Legal Aid Society and later acted as executive director of the Association of Legal Aid Attorneys. Welcome, Donna. And finally, Khalil Muhammad, who is professor of history, race, and public policy at Harvard's Kennedy School, and the Suzanne Young Murray Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. He previously led the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture here in New York City, and Dr. Muhammad is the author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of a Modern Urban America, which won the 2011 John Hope Franklin Best Book Award in American Studies. Welcome, Khalil. So we have a phenomenal panel and limited time, so I want to just jump right in. And I'd really love to talk a little bit about what you see as parallels, again, between the movement of the civil rights era and our current moment in history. What is different about the two, and where do you see the parallels? How can we build on those parallels to transform what many people believe may be moments into a sustained movement? Khalil?
Sure. Well, I think that the first, most obvious thing is that young people were part of it, and your youth in that period attest to both the commitment and the imagination and the creativity. Dr. King was very fond of talking about such things as creative dissent or creative dissatisfaction, because what he recognized is that as a young person himself, and then to be challenged by even younger people, that it was that kind of courage in the face of uncertainty, the willingness to imagine possibilities, to defy the rules, to question the wisdom of the elders, even, who would caution against too much exuberance. He broke away from the National Baptist Convention precisely because it wasn't radical enough to meet the challenges of the moment. And I see that. For example, in the case of Stephen, why am I forgetting his last name?
Stephen
Clark. Yes, Stephen Clark, killed in Sacramento a few days ago. His brother literally jumped on the dais of the city council out of frustration. Out of frustration for the dithering about the circumstances of the police killing. And I can't help but think that in the visual of this young man is the same abhorrence of the disrespect and incivility. Now, of course, Dr. King engaged in the kind of practice of nonviolent civil disobedience that was very disciplined. But he was working also against those pressures of young people who wanted to express their outrage and to give voice to that. And so I see that all around in the amazing activism whether we call it Black Lives Matter, or whether we call it Me Too, or Never Again, or Say Her Name. And we're still, whether it's the media proper or it's the institutions that sometimes, this activism is being expressed in college campuses, for example, or foundations that are giving platforms to it, or other nonprofit organizations, there's still the need or the desire to try to clamp down on that. And I think that Dr. King teaches us that we need more of that in the end. We need to see that express itself in the ways that force the rest of us to catch up. Now, of course, there's all kinds of strategy and there's organizing and this sort of thing, but I think to the extent that what excites me about these two moments and what excites me about the legacy of the civil rights era is precisely that young people are stepping up to that challenge.
So I agree with you. What I will add is that we also see that there still are those inherent tensions between generations. And just as we saw in the early days of the civil rights movement, the tension between the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. What we saw, not so much with March for Our Lives and Never Again, but what we began to see 2-3 years ago with the Black Lives Matter movement was that there was a disconnect or a tension between the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement and some of the civil rights leaders that are still around today. You did your work, you got us to a certain point, but you didn't get us across the finish line, and so what is the value that you bring to the table at this point? And in turn, civil rights leaders of old wanting to say, but you know what, we've got some wisdom here, and if we work together, or wait, don't move me from the mic, like I still have my role to play and I still own this stage, and then trying to figure out how you come together to figure out whether or not there is value add that one can give to the other. I actually remember hearing Reverend Al Sharpton say, interestingly, he said that he had some tension with the leaders of the Black Lives Movement, particularly when he got to Ferguson in the wake of the Michael Brown killing, and he said that what he needed to help, what he wanted them to appreciate was that they had youth and energy that came with youth. He had age and wisdom that came with his experience, and if we could put the two together, how powerful could we be? And that's some of what we saw happen with the civil rights, with SCLC, and with SNCC, the coming together.
So Jennifer, women also played a really important part in the civil rights movement, but it was, with some obvious exceptions, it was largely unseen. Their sacrifices were often unseen by the general public. So, I think a lot about this issue. I know you do too, and I would love to hear your thoughts on how you've seen the role of women change in these political movements since the 1960s.
So, thinking about that, I'm reminded of the fact that the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, grew out of the faith community, and as you said, the National Baptist Convention didn't want to buy into this agenda, and thus was founded the Progressive National Baptist Convention, which my father actually co-founded along with Dr. King and several others. The interesting thing is that if we think for a moment that this was a movement, the civil rights movement was born, was birthed by religious leaders, Black Baptist leaders in the main. Well, the Black church historically did not embrace women in leadership roles. But the fact of the matter is that women have always led in the church behind the scenes. And that's what we saw play out in the civil rights movement. Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, and many, many more. They were leading and they were doing their part, helping to found the PMBC, the SCLC, and SNCC. But they weren't visible to everybody. I think what we're seeing now is we are seeing greater visibility. The question will be, though, whether or not we will see it in these moments and movements that expand beyond issue-focused movements. So we see with the Women's March, women leadership. But even though the Women's March is about all issues, because every issue, as has been said before, is a woman's issue, it's still largely seen as a woman's movement. When we look at some of these other movements, we have to see whether or not women will be viewed as the leaders of them and really embraced in that way. We are stepping up. We are owning our leadership spaces, but how will history tell the story? One last point on that. Black Lives Matter was founded and really came into its own in the wake of the Trayvon Martin killing and Michael Brown and Ferguson. But the interesting thing is that that movement was founded in part by the leaders, 3 black women who wanted to bring attention to the experience of transgender women being mistreated by police. But how much do we really hear about the experience of transgender women? So that movement took hold, but it really took hold and became the experience largely of black males. So you had black women bringing an issue to the forefront, but somehow the issue that they were bringing forward was minimized or took a back seat to the issue of black males. So I think there's still this tension that we've got to figure out. We're out here and we're doing the work. We've always been doing the work. We're more visible. But how do the messages get co-opted? Or how do our roles get co-opted?
And so just to follow up on that a little bit, I mean, what do you see as opportunity? I mean, there are some benefits to that, for sure. There are also huge untapped opportunities by changing that dynamic, and I'm curious, what you see as the opportunities for changing that trajectory.
Well, I think that women, it's well documented that women will share leadership and will share the space before the media and the camera, that we're not, let me back up and say it a little differently because I don't want to offend anybody. Women very often lead more by engaging in cooperative opportunities, people working and partnering together. And so I think that the opportunity here is that women will step up again and share the mic, share the podium. You look at the Women's March. What came out of that moment or movement are several leaders, not just one, but several people willing to share the space with others. You take the most recent, the Never Again, and the kids stepping up. It's not just one leader, and we see females and males. I think that there's opportunity for inclusion. Women, just the Black Lives Matter saying we want to represent the concerns not just of some, but of all who've been victimized by police. I think there's greater opportunity for increasing the understanding of the issues that present, and of not trying to dominate or hog the space. And maybe we'll get an opportunity to talk a little bit more about news and media and how one person gets kind of put out there as the person and the challenges with that. But I think women are willing to share the space.
Yeah. So I definitely want to come back to that. Donna, I'm mindful of the fact that you have been at the front of many important fights. And you also have this kind of breadth and arc of perspective of having seen so many of them. And I'm curious kind of what you see as the particular challenges, the unique challenges of these kind of current popular movements, these campaigns, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, the Women's March, Never Again, March for Our Lives. Are there things that you see that make them particularly vulnerable, or that perhaps, whether it's through distributed leadership or other things, strengthen them in some way?
Yeah, I think the challenge of the movement at this moment in history is whether we can transform the March for the Women's March, the Me Too movement, the March for Our Lives, the Dreamers fight for a path to citizenship, Black Lives Matter, from a moment or from a bunch of moments to the mass movement that we need. And you know, we have a bit of help along the way from that very, very, very white house. And I think the question is whether we'll be able to transform the existential threat posed by that very, very, very white house and the Congress that supports it into a deeper, into a broad movement that recognizes that it's made up of different strands of issues and main concerns, and different groups, people who identify in a whole based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, whether we can understand each other and what the main things that drive us, whether we can make intersectionality something that makes us stronger because we have a better understanding of you know, sort of what dignity and human rights means in this society, what democracy means. My little granddaughter said, she's chanting, show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. She turns to her mom, and we have it on video. She turns to her mom and says, what's democracy? And my daughter, she's really good, she said, you know, these days, nobody knows. And so whether we can transform, you know, the things that drive us and the differences that bind us, kind of, you know, and that make us targets, and also a movement that has to fight back, whether we can figure out how to weave that into something strong that can fight for the values, the good values that our country, you know, is predicated on. You know, I feel like, you know, everybody I know is like in the crosshairs of this administration, and everything I hold dear and kind of counted on, that we all counted on as being here for us, as the values that our society is built on, that we're leaving to our kids, is up for grabs. And so we kind of have no choice in the matter. And you know, great movements, you know, are not necessarily the product of fabulous designs and like well thought out strategies, sad to say. I think they're as much the product, you need all that, but you need to sort of like seize the moment. And, you know, Bobby Seale used to say, seize the time. And it's really true. You know, we have to we fight for our principles day in, day out. And there are moments that are created, and they're not necessarily of our making. We try, and we have to be there to seize the time. You know, I remember last year thinking, you know, after 9/11, the ACLU, the NYCLU, we were trying so hard, working with allies to try to fight off this anti-Muslim craze, you know, the fear-based hostility to people just because of their religion or where they come from. And you know, you have a rally, you have a teach-in, you have a panel, you know, and a handful of the same old would show up. You know, and then after January 31st of last year, after the Muslim ban, all of a sudden, everybody's out in the streets saying no ban, no wall, fighting for, you know, Muslims to be treated with dignity, fighting for all immigrants to be treated with dignity. And it was like, oh my God, look what he's done for us, you know. And so we have to seize this moment and make them like really regret it.
You know, just building on your point, I think, what we saw was relevance and people see, like, identifying and relating. And that's what we saw with the civil rights movement. People who joined that movement, many people, not everybody, could directly identify, but they could relate from a moral perspective. What we also saw with the civil rights movement in the bus boycott was an early win, a relatively early win. And the Muslim ban back in 2017 felt like an early win. The Women's March felt like an early win. And those are some of the things that sustain moments and can help turn them into movements when people feel like we've got some traction here. We're identifying, we're relating. If you don't have that, you can begin to lose people. And the concern that I think that, that I have right now is what sustains? Like, what are these continuing wins where people can see themselves, they can identify, they feel there's relevance, and they want to engage. If you don't have that, people begin to fall off, especially if they don't see the wins.
Yeah, so I want to go a little deeper with that because I think, part of healthy democracy is debate, it is difference, and it's creating the platform for robust and passionate discussion around issues of difference. And yet we've lost our way in being able to have conversation about different points of view. We know that within the civil rights movement, within these campaigns, there are differences, and they're important differences, and they need to be debated. And yet we also know that to sustain this, we need solidarity as well. And how do we reconcile those two things? How do we allow for the kind of productive, healthy debate and discourse that we know we need and that is emblematic of a healthy democracy, and also create a sense of solidarity that will allow us to push forward in a powerful way? Khalil?
So let me take a stab at this because I think there's some post-civil rights lessons that have been ignored and lost in this moment, and I think that they're going to revisit us with a vengeance if we don't pay closer attention. So it seems to me that in the Trump moment, and we've been talking a lot about resistance vis-a-vis 2017, but part of the problem, and I'm just going to cite a lot of different things. So your organization sued the city under a liberal mayor, though representing the Republican Party, who fashioned arrest records on people who, by dint of a mass carceral regime or mass incarceration, almost ensured that a lot of those people would either be civically or politically disengaged or actually not able to vote at some point in their adult lives. Certainly wasn't a pro-democratic criminal justice response to the poverty of Black and brown people in New York City. We also saw the emergence in the early aftermath of the civil rights movement of a national strategy by the Nixon administration, but fully embraced by African American elites, called Black capitalism, to completely invert the vision of Dr. King's late-stage democratic socialist vision, to imagine the success of the movement as individual materialism and economic success as the gold standard. Now, there are long traditions of economic self-reliance within the African American community, and certainly property ownership and businesses, et cetera. But this produced an attitude that essentially redefined poverty as completely self-induced, as a measure of personal failing, which was articulated by those elites as they moved into positions of various firsts in government office at the federal and state level, and mayoralties and other kinds of appointed positions. I think it's also important to note that our own liberal alliances have been fractured by dint of even this city, in the midst of the NYCLU lawsuits. By a 2-to-1 margin, white New Yorkers were supporting stop and frisk, according to Quinnipiac, and Black folks, including 30% of Black folks, were also supporting it. So I think it's really easy in the Trump moment to see this consolidation of shared vulnerability, when in fact the Democratic Party itself essentially rigged a primary that featured an independent Bernie Sanders with all of his 74-year-old baggage and, you know, not quite the kind of rhetorical big tent person who, you know, the moment probably called for, but nevertheless, we should have had a fair primary, which we did not have, and it wasn't just the Russians' fault. And then finally, and then finally you had a president, a brilliant black man, incredibly gifted and a kind of moral beacon of propriety in the world, you know, just what the doctor would order now, but certainly we had then. And yet the community organizer didn't have a lot to say for community organizing as president, when his own Justice Department was well aware of the efforts to essentially gut the Voting Rights Act before the Shelby decision. You know, I'll never forget the second inaugural when Obama used this alliteration, which, you know, was brilliant, as was so much of his speech making. But he essentially said from Seneca Falls to Selma to Stonewall, as a way of sort of this big arc of social movements going back to the women's movement of the 19th century, as a measure of taking the temperature of America's capacity to always get it right, and in this case, getting it right by voting for me a second time. And yet, the final nails in the coffin were being hammered into the Supreme Court decision of Shelby versus Holder. Surely. So I don't know how you simultaneously evoke Selma in a moment when you know that we're about to lose the very legacy. Seems to me once you won the election, it'd be precisely the moment to call attention to those retrograde forces in society that were gaining ground. And of course, Black Lives Matter comes along, and mostly Obama spent time publicly scolding young black people to not be so brash, to not be so disrespectful, to maybe focus on graduating college, or to respect the fact that government moves slow, or that consensus and compromise are the art of the deal. And I'm not okay with that. I'm still not okay with it, because I feel like the moment that is required now is too easy. It's too easy to see the White House as the ultimate evil, when in fact, I think the circumstances, aside from all of the naked racism that exists, that is often out there, far away from at home, is not that far away. And the elite manipulation of poor people in our own backyards is not going to go away. And so if we don't take seriously that it is in fact poor people of color who started this process of resistance before a white women's march, and I know that black women and Muslim women helped to organize that, but the impetus for that mass movement was about white women's vulnerability in the wake of the Trump election. If we don't go back to the world that black women and brown women organizing for domestic workers who were being preyed upon as sexual victims before a Me Too moment, if we don't go back to the world that they were trying to help us realize, then we're going to find ourselves in the same loop. We're going to find ourselves facing the same despair that Dr. King faced in 1967 and 1968, where he really wasn't sure that we as a country were capable of living up to the transformation that was required at that time. Yeah. So solidarity is going to require a lot more self-reflection of the good people in these stories. Yeah.
So how do we serve our own individual interests from our perspective and analysis, and at the same time dare to believe that that which seems competitive, often in opposition to our perspective, or claiming to be more important an emphasis than the one we were holding? How do we do that? Well, this is why I say that black people, so my banner tonight is saying, you know, I used to feel like being black was kind of second class, but the more I look at contemporary problems, being black was not such a bad thing, because, as Gitlow used to say to Captain Cotchby, being colored is a whole lot of fun when ain't nobody looking. But the reality is, the motto, I am because we are, was fundamental to African self-understanding. So I may be different from you, but I am not totally who I am until I have the perspective that you bring to it. So I'm, in a sense, partialized apart from wrestling with the difference that you represent. Now, I think that this is, you don't get this from partialized, compartmentalized, categorized thinking, Cartesian thinking, but African understanding, at least philosophically. We do not always live it out because we have as many fights as everybody else, but at least philosophically, before we were tampered with too much, we had much greater capacity, I think, to imagine that I could be significantly right without you being totally wrong. I think that means, so what I would really wish to push is that if black folks could ever get back to being free, to be honest about their African sensibilities, slavery did a thing on us, but if we could ever get back to that, we might have something to offer in these very difficult, polarized times. And I mean, that's the case I want to make.
You know, when you were speaking earlier, you talked about essentially the need for a moral imperative, and that we've lost our way. And I think that until we reclaim as a society, you know, reclaim, clarify, define what is our moral imperative, we will have a hard time seeking and finding this solidarity.
So I know I'm getting the time signal, but I feel like we could talk for hours. But I do want to come back to this question of the media, because it's come up in a couple of different ways. And you know, when you look at what's happening, traditional media is playing a role, alternative media is playing a role, social media, and you know, there are some really significant benefits to the use of social media. Information is dispersed very quickly and broadly, and it can help to mobilize people. But the downside of this constant communication and this constant 24-hour news cycle is that, you know, a story comes and goes, and then another one takes its place. And so as we think about the words you closed with, Dr. Forbes, about the importance of going to the source, about the importance of taking time to understand and to learn the depth of the issues, the complexity of the problem and the path, how do we juxtapose this very quick news media cycle and the benefits of this instant social media organization with the really requirement of time and study and depth and endurance to have a sustained movement?
I'm working on trying to get the handbook together for what it really means to be a member of the Dream Team. I wish one of the rules of being on the Dream Team is that nobody who wants to be on the Dream Team can be without a network of persons with whom they have sit-down dinner conversation for more than a half hour, at least once a month. Twice a month. If you take all of your insight and allow your sensibilities to be shaped by the multiple forms of media input that come to you, you will be as crazy as a bedbug. Everybody needs a network of folks. I think I'd like your idea. At least twice a month, you must have at least, how many is a good number? How many folks that we're going to meet?
10, at minimum.
10, and we're going to ask what's going on. And we're not, what did Rachel say? No. What did Fox say? No. What? I want to, that is not the issue. What's going on? And you won't know until you've met with, what do the Jewish people call it? You got to have a quorum. How many you have? A minyan. You got to have a minyan. A conversation with a minyan group of people whose fundamental values are at least within range that conversation is possible. Got to have that conversation. If you don't have at least twice a month, you're not as intelligent as you think you should be.
So can I elaborate on that a little bit? Probably not where you thought I would go, but I think as we are bombarded with all sorts of bullshit, I can say it.
You can
say it. I think that one of the things that is really critically important that we as people who believe in democracy and movement, however we define it, have to recognize the importance of is education. You know, our country democracy requires a system of free, secular, public education. And that principle and those institutions are under attack like they have never been before. You know, whether it's Betsy DeVos, who wants to privatize and Christianize our education, or the charter folks who want to sap money and turn education into this new frontier for capitalism and money making. You know, talk to Pearson, the testers. We have to stand up for free public education that teaches to kids, not to tests, that teaches kids and helps them understand what it means to learn to be critical thinkers in our society. Because if we don't do that, we're creating a whole generation of people, including ourselves, who may have factual answers or may, look at news and say, oh, is this right or is that right, but don't know how to think critically about it. Well, we need the critical thinking of the kids. The good news, of course, is that the kids are showing us that regardless, despite what they're being taught in school, they know how to think for themselves.
We're on the same page, and we've actually talked about this issue before, the importance of education and the lack of critical thinking being taught in the public schools. I theorize it's kind of like a conspiracy of sorts that, in America, you actually really aren't taught to think critically until you go to graduate school, unless you go to a strong liberal arts college. And, if you're not in or if you're in a strong independent school or a public school where there are a lot of resources, you may learn critical thinking early on. But in the main, we're not teaching children to think critically, because if you teach everybody how to think critically, then you can't go to war, because you can't get people to join the army, and you can't get people to vote for a draft, right? If you teach people to think critically, they're going to think 2 and 3 times about whether or not this war makes sense. We saw the Parkland students rise up, but we also saw that these children had debate in their schools, right? They had journalism classes, and they had classes in theater, right? They were actually studying in their debate classes gun control and gun control reform. So that's why when things broke out, they were so, quote, articulate. But the disparities persist. So you've got to be, it's education, but we have to go back to, at the core, it is racism, systemic and structural and institutional racism, capitalism, and militarism that still pervades this country, that keeps certain people in communities from getting ahead and certain people from actually being able to grab the mic and speak about gun control in days such as these, right? You know, and so until we really grapple with those issues, we can talk about moments and we can talk about movements all we want, but until this country wrestles with the impact of racism from its very foundation, its very beginnings, and how that is compounded by capitalism that keeps racism in play, because we've got to have some people winning and some people losing. So what's the best way to decide upon that? By deciding that, you know, that the white man is on top and the black woman is on bottom and everybody else falls somewhere along the way. So until we deal with that, solidarity, movement building, we're going to be hard-pressed to get everybody around the table really moving.
Right on.
Can I share a word from Dr. King? So this comes from Where Do We Go From Here, and published in 1967. He says, education without social action is a one-sided value because it has no true power potential. So I'll say that again. Education without social action is a one-sided value because it has no true power potential. Social action without education is a weak expression of pure energy. Our policies should have true strengths of deep analysis beneath them to be able to challenge the clever sophistries of our opponents. Most heartening among the young, the spirit of challenge and determination for change is becoming an unquenchable force. How shall we turn the ghettos into a vast school? So just to close with that, for me, on the Parkland example that you just described, privatization of public education is systematically miseducating the poor and black and brown children. Systematically miseducating. Because the only goal of privatization is to create docile people in this society. It used to be that they would be docile employees, that they would pull the levers of their machines without losing their arms because they could read the signs. But otherwise, it's not clear that we even have work for most people across the landscape of this country. So the only point of education now is to create people who follow rules. And following rules starts with taking tests.
That's right.
And being quiet in the hallways. And being told that the only useful thing that you can do is to imagine yourself one day being a scientist or an engineer or a computer programmer, knowing full well that that those jobs will never be sufficient to employ most young people, nor is that a measure of freedom. Because freedom in education means the freedom to find the things that animate your mind, that fuel your curiosity, that feed your spirit. And everybody knows this, likely in this room, who has received a good quality education, especially in college. It's precisely the point that your curiosity will make you a good citizen and a useful member of society. So I just want to be clear that Dr. King had a very specific kind of education in mind. He didn't just have this thing that we all think we agree upon. He wanted people's education to be for the purpose of social action. He wanted to educate the ghetto, not that they could all go out and be capitalists or they could end up at Harvard. He wanted them to be people who would have a conscience, who would be equipped to deal with the sophistries of our opponents in order to change the world.
So I really feel like we just got started, and I hope that we can invite you all back to continue this conversation. I sense that there's a playbook coming for the Dream Team, and that we'll hear a lot more about Jubilee Justice, and I would love for this to be the start of a deep and rich conversation. Thank you all for joining us tonight.